It is the voice of Indiana County, WCCS 101.1 FM and AM 1160. Our conversation this morning with Bill Madden, the author of Tom Seaver, A Terrific Life, is brought to you by Marcus and Mack, a law firm representing injured people. And yeah, it's Tom Seaver. And yeah, we Bucco fans, we're right here in the Pittsburgh neighborhood. We watched Tom Seaver for years and years and years and got frustrated because it just couldn't hit the guy. But it is a terrific life you write about. Bill, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Wonderful, and it's good to have you on the air with us. Bill, you know, normally when I do these conversations with our author friends, I get at some point in the interview into the sourcing and how it was that you were able to gather the information. These came right from Tom Seaver's mouth in many cases, and the interviews that you conducted. And it must have been heartbreaking for you to watch as you did this series of interviews over the course of a couple of years, to watch his deterioration and then to finally hear of his death. That had to have taken an emotional toll on you.
It did, because we were friends. This was more than just a writer-player relationship. It kind of changed in 1983, because I didn't cover him when he was with the Mets. I was on the Yankee beat for the Daily News during that period. And but in 1983, when the Mets left him unprotected for something called the free agent compensation pool, and he had to leave the Mets for the second time, I got tipped to this story by somebody in the commissioner's office who told me that the Mets had left him unprotected. And it was probably one of the biggest stories I ever broke for the Daily News. But after I got a confirmation from Frank Cash and the general manager that they had left him unprotected, I felt I had an obligation to call Seaver and not blindside him with his story the next day. You couldn't do that today, obviously, in the age of the Internet and Twitter and everything. But I did call him, and he was very appreciative of that. And from that day on, I think he kind of looked at me as more than just another writer. He looked at me as a guy who he could trust, and also a guy that was plugged in a lot of big places in baseball. So anyway, from that point on, we had a relationship, and we would talk to each other on the phone and things like that. And then, of course, what happened in 2015, a friend of mine came to me. He had started a production company. He wanted to do a documentary on Seaver and myself, mainly on Seaver, but emphasizing our relationship also as part of this whole documentary. And he agreed to do it. And so we went out there in 2016 and 2017 out to his place in Calistoga where he had built his vineyard. And we did. I'd interviewed him many times, of course, over the years. So I had all these other interviews, exclusive interviews, in my so-called vault. And then, of course, we added to it for the documentary. And what happened was, the second time we went out there in 2017, it was unbelievable to me how much he had slipped, his memory and everything, because of what had happened to him was a recurrence of Lyme disease, which he first incurred 30 years earlier when he was living in Greenwich. And Lyme disease came back, and he didn't realize it had come back, and he didn't do anything about treating it because he was having these series of memory lapses, and he had equilibrium problems occasionally, and a lot of the symptoms of Lyme disease, but he was afraid he'd had a stroke or something. And so as a result of that, or Alzheimer's, and he was afraid to go to the doctors. And when he finally did go to the doctors, they told him that the good news is you don't have Alzheimer's, but the bad news is your Lyme disease came back and it's done a lot of damage to your brain cells. And we can arrest it temporarily, but your memory is going to continue to get worse. And which is what happened. When we went out there in 2017, I was amazed at how much he had slipped memory-wise. He couldn't remember anything about his career and things like that, the highlights of his career, which was a direct contrast to the previous year. And so it was shortly after the documentary was released in 2019 that the family put out the statement that he was suffering from dementia and dropping out of public life. And it was at that point that the people I had worked on the documentary with told me Billy, you got to do the book on him now. You have to do the book. I had always been reluctant to do an autobiography because of his memory lapses and the issues he was having. And so that's really what happened. I did the book because people told me that I was the only guy that could do this book properly because of my relationship with him. His agent told me he would want you to do the book. And so that's how the book came about. But it was a very painful process for me because a big part of the book is the last chapter, in which I trace his gradual decline into dementia.
Even as we watch that unfold before us, as we read the book, we see it coming, and we don't want it to happen, but it does. Let's go back and talk about Tom Seaver, the pitcher. Now, I remember when the Pirates had John Lieber come up, and Jim Leland said, this guy, he looks like Seaver on the mound, and how much pressure that put on John Lieber. Once Tom Seaver started dominating baseball, they were looking, every major league team was looking for another Tom Seaver, but there was only one, wasn't there?
There was only one. He was in an era where there was a lot of great pitchers, all of whom went to the Hall of Fame. You had Bob Gibson and Jim Palmer and Steve Carlton and Phil Niekro, but of all of them, Seaver was clearly the best for a number of reasons. He was the smartest player I ever covered in all my years of covering baseball, and he used to tell me, he says, I know what I was. I was an artist out there, and he was. He, besides just having a 96-mile-an-hour fastball and a matching slider, this guy knew how to get batters out. Somebody once told me that when Seaver was pitching, he was always 2 pitches ahead on every batter. In other words, thinking 2 pitches down the road. And a classic example of that is a story in the book which Tony La Russa tells, that La Russa had a deal with Seaver. He was the one pitcher that he would let make his own decision about whether he was coming out of the game or not. And there was a game in which Seaver got in a little bit of trouble in the 6th or 7th inning. It was 2 outs, but there was a runner on third base. It was a 1-run game. La Russa comes out to the mound. There's a left-handed hitter coming up, a dangerous left-handed hitter. And Seaver says to La Russa, "Don't worry, I got this guy." So La Russa reluctantly turns around and goes back to the dugout. But on his way back to the dugout, Seaver yells at him, "But by the way, just so you know, I'm going to fall behind in the count 2-0, and then I'm going to get him to pop up to the third baseman." So La Russa's shaking his head. Sure enough, Seaver falls behind in the count 2-0. The batter at the plate, the left-handed batter, is at the plate, and he's digging in for that fastball. And all of a sudden, Seaver turns around and he throws him a changeup, and the guy overswings and hits a pop-up to the third baseman. Seaver walks off the mound and he winks at La Russa.
It's amazing. Just an amazing story. The Rick Monday story is hilarious, too. Tom Seaver was not only intellectual, he was a bit of an imp, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. He had a great sense of humor, and yes, he was. There was an impish side of him. He loved pranking on guys and having fun with guys. And of course, the Rick Monday story. They had been teammates in Alaska in a summer wood bat league in Alaska, and so they became pretty good friends. And actually, I don't know the exact stats, but Monday is the all-time best hitter against Seaver as far as home runs and batting average and everything else. But anyway, they wound up getting together, being opponents in the All-Star game a few years later. And Monday was playing for the American League, and Seaver was pitching for the National League, and they ran into each other in the hotel lobby. And Monday's mother recognized Seaver. She remembered seeing them. She was up in Alaska, I guess, watching them both play together up in Alaska. And she says, "Oh, there's Tom over there." So Seaver goes over to the lobby and introduces his mother to Monday. And then they start talking, and Seaver says, "Look, if the chance comes up that I wind up facing you today in the All-Star game, I just want you to know I'm going to throw you nothing but fastballs, okay?" So Monday says, "Okay, you got a deal." So they get out to... Sure enough, in the first inning, I think it was in the first inning of the game, Monday happened to come up to bat against Seaver. And Seaver, there might have been runners on base. I can't remember. But anyway, first pitch Seaver throws to Monday is a changeup. Monday hits it on the ground and grounds out to first base. And he's screaming at Seaver all the way down the first base line. And then after the game, Monday screamed at him again. He says, "You lied. Not only did you lie to me, you lied to my mother."
That's beautiful. What a beautiful story. We're talking this morning with Bill Madden. Tom Seaver, A Terrific Life is the book. There's a very, very serious part to this book as well, having to do with Seaver, his two departures from the Mets badly mangling it both times. And Tom Seaver standing up not only for himself but for other ball players. He was a man of great integrity, even as he was being unjustly attacked by guys, and you wouldn't think this, but guys like Dick Young. Tom Seaver stood up for himself and others.
Yes, he was. Of course, that was the infamous Daily News versus Tom Seaver, darkest day in Mets history in June of 1977. The year before, free agency had come into play in baseball, and a lot of Seaver's fellow pitchers and players were getting these huge free agent contracts after the 76 season. And Seaver had told the Mets he was already in the process. He was already had a 3-year contract with the Mets. And he had told them, he said, "I have no desire to become a free agent and leave the Mets. I want to stay here." But what happened was, after that 76 season, when he saw all these other pitchers getting these huge contracts, including Nolan Ryan, his former teammate, who had gotten a big contract with the Angels. So Seaver went to the Mets and he said, "Look, I don't want to get a new contract here, but what I would like to do, I would like to hope that you would renegotiate my present contract in order to give me at least on a par with what these other pitchers are making. I think I deserve that." Well, M. Donald Grant, the chairman of the team, wanted nothing to do with that. In addition to that, Grant was adamantly against free agency, and he went out of his way not to sign any free agents. So you had a double-barreled situation going on between Seaver and Grant. Seaver was criticizing Grant in the paper for not signing any free agents, and he was also embroiled in this whole contract dispute with Grant. And finally, Grant enlisted the services of Dick Young, who was the editor, who was the powerful columnist for the New York Daily News, and I must say, a mentor of mine and the guy who hired me at the Daily News. So anyway, Young is writing a series of columns very critical of Seaver, just ripping him, calling him greedy and ingrate and a cancer on the team. And at the same time, Grant is threatening to trade Seaver. So the situation finally got resolved, or at least they thought it was resolved, when Seaver went over Grant's head and arranged his own contract renegotiation with the owner of the Mets, Mrs. DeRolay, who was the daughter of Joan Payson, the original Mets owner. And it looked like it was settled, except that Dick Young decided to write one more column. And in the book, I say it was the 33 words that effectively drove Tom Seaver out of town. And those 33 words were, quote, "Nolan Ryan is getting more now than Seaver. And that galls Tom because Nancy Seaver and Ruth Ryan are very friendly, and Tom Seaver has long treated Nolan Ryan like a little brother," end quote. So the Mets were in Atlanta. This was the trading deadline, June 15th, 1977, and the Mets were in Atlanta. Seaver was sitting around the pool, and somebody showed him a copy of Young's column. He read the column, got up from his chair at the pool, went into his room, called the Mets general manager, Joe McDonald in New York, and screamed at him and said, "Get me the hell out of here. This is the last straw. I cannot take them bringing my family into this thing. He's gone too far this time. Get me out of here." And so, later that night, M. Donald Grant traded Seaver to the Reds, and he also traded Dave Kingman, their all-time leading home run hitter at the time, who was also involved in a contract dispute. And that was what they called the Midnight Massacre and the darkest day in Mets history.
We can read about it in Tom Seaver, A Terrific Life. Bill, I have the feeling we could go on for another hour or two, but we're out of time this morning. I know that Nancy Seaver is a big, big part of not only Tom's story, but of your being able to write this book, and we certainly can read about her as well. She's such an integral part of it. But I want to thank you for being with us this morning. This has been great, and the book is a wonderful read.
Thank you very much. Yes, it is. It's a very deeply personal book.
Have a great day today.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. Okay,